So I'm going to tell you about our next speaker, who is Kimberly Harmon. And she helped train our previous speaker, so that was nice. You probably trained him when you're like 15 years old. Okay, so she's a professor in family practice here at the UW as well, and also in orthopedics and sports medicine. She's program director in primary care sports medicine fellowship and associate head team physician at the University of Washington. Her research interests include tendinopathy. So anytime we put opathy, that means it's busted. So just put tendon is busted. Okay, sudden cardiac death and concussions in athletes. She's active on national levels, including the president of the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, and currently serves on their foundation board. She's chair of the recently published AMSSM position statement on concussion, which you heard a little bit about earlier. Member of the NCAA Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sport Committee and serves as a consultant to NCAA. There she is with the Husky team physicians. And here she is. I got to say, you've done a lot with your life, and you have 4 boys, which is like a whole separate life. She attended the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, where she was a student athletic trainer and played basketball. She earned a medical degree at Indiana University, completed a residency at Memorial Family Practice Residency in South Bend, Indiana, where she was chief resident. So after you finish your residency, if you're extra good, they make you the chief resident. So that means she's really good. Okay, she completed the Ball Memorial Hospital Primary Care Sports Medicine Fellowship in Muncie, Indiana, and then finally we got her to leave Indiana, where she comes to Husky football and women's basketball and has been at the UW ever since. Yes, excellent. And so I give him a big hand of welcome. We'll hear from Dr. Harmon.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm actually from the Northwest. I went to high school up in South Everett, so I'm actually back home. So I just was in Indiana for a brief stint of training. So I'm going to talk about concussion today to start out with. So one of the things that I've noticed about concussion is that really, I've been on the football sideline for 25 years now, over 25 years actually. I started out as an athletic trainer and now as a team physician. And thoughts about concussion have really, really changed over the last 25 years. And I think this pendulum changing is a great sort of representative of it. But really, I think that this is also a very good representation of it. And this either I have to give credit to or blame to my colleague in South Africa, who's a team physician over there. I think that our thoughts about concussion have really evolved over time. And I think this is never more clear. As we put together this statement, this took us about 1.5 years to collect all the evidence and look at it. And the AMSSM is a group of over 2,100 basically team physicians who are sideline team physicians at every level, from youth sports to professional sports. And the purpose of this statement was really to look at all the evidence and come out with the best evidence to really help guide team physicians in the evaluation and management of concussion. There's a lot of concussions out there, almost 4 million concussions, and a lot of those are just the ones that are reported. And so a lot of concussions are happening out there. But the ones that we hear about mostly are football. And so as a football doctor, I really think that football gets kind of a bad rap. And a lot of this is tied up with the NFL. And the NFL is, there's a lot of stuff going on with the players' union, and there's a lot of money involved with it. And so I want to talk about concussions a little bit from a little bit of a different perspective. You know, a lot of concussions occur outside of football. And so they can occur in extreme sports and mountain biking and skateboarding. And I was just snowboarding or ski. I wasn't snowboarding, I was skiing. My kids were snowboarding, and I was frightened as I watched them snowboarding. Of course, they're not very good snowboarders. And this picture right here really resonates with me as a mother of 4 boys. My boys come up with all sorts of stupid ways to think about hurting themselves. And so when I look at that picture, it just reminds me sort of my life. And football really seems not kind of a tame way for them to go entertain themselves. And And so when we think about football and concussions and how many concussions they really cause, you need to think about how do you actually come up with a concussion rate? And how you come up with a concussion rate is you have to take the number of athletes that play a sport, the concussion rate in that sport, and then how many athlete exposures there are. And so when you look at football, and just let's take high school football, for example, there's 1,100,000 high school football athletes. The concussion rate for football in high school athletes, we know this because we keep statistics on high school athletes, it's 6.4 per athlete exposure. In high school football, there's about 60 athlete exposures a year. There's about 50 practices and 10 games. And so that equals about 42,000 high school football concussions a year. Now let's do the same math for high school soccer. It's a little bit harder for soccer. We know that there's 782,000 and some change soccer athletes, both male and female. So there's less high school soccer athletes. We know the concussion rates, but when we get to how many athlete exposures for soccer players, it gets a little bit harder because there's the high school soccer season, but most soccer athletes also play year-round, and they play on a couple teams, and so they don't play just during that most high school football athletes just play during the high school football season. And so if you try and extrapolate the soccer season, you actually, so if you kind of assume that 80% of your soccer players are going to play 5 times a week, you get about the same number of concussions, about 40,000 concussions a year in soccer and high school athletes. And that's probably a pretty conservative estimate of how much our soccer players actually play. And if we do so in any given year between football and soccer, there's probably about the same number of concussions in both high school soccer and high school football. So that's sort of an interesting thought. And then let's look at our youth sports. There's about 3 million youth kids that play tackle football. And when we look at youth soccer, it's harder to get estimates of how many kids actually play youth soccer, but it is the most popular youth sport in the United States. And somewhere between 15 million and 20 million kids play youth soccer. And it's the same sort of thing when you're thinking about incidents, because kids play soccer year-round, and they play in the parking lot, and they play in indoor soccer, they play outdoor soccer, and the kids play football for a very defined time. They play from the middle of August to the end of October, and they only play during football season. And so the number of concussions that you can have from youth soccer, just by the sheer number of kids that are playing and the length of time that are playing, becomes much higher. So what's a real concern with concussion? And that's my oldest son up there. Is it lost time from school when a kid gets a concussion? Is it the lost time from sport? I mean, those are both bad things that happen. Is it that somebody might get a catastrophic head injury? That would be awful. You know, what it really is, for most people, is all the press that this chronic traumatic encephalopathy has been getting, and from our NFL players. And when you look at some of these guys up here, you might recognize some of them. Iron Mike Webster, he's a Pittsburgh Steeler. Dave Duerson, he shot himself in the chest so that his brain could be examined in this project, so they could look and see if he had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which he did. Junior Seau just killed himself in the same thing. And so this is getting a tremendous amount of press, and it's really frightening. And you see this, and you think, oh my gosh, is my kid that's out there playing soccer, are they going to end up like this? And should they really be playing soccer? And they have a research center at Harvard, and they just recently published this study. It was 2 months ago. They analyzed 85 postmortem brains, and they looked to see whether they had chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And then they analyzed 18 brains that didn't have any sorts of signs of these symptoms. And they, in that group, there was 35 professional football players, and 34 had changes of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. 1 had no changes, and two of the players were asymptomatic. And others that also had changes in that group of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, there was 9 college football players, 6 high school football players, 4 hockey players, 7 professional boxers, an amateur boxer, and professional wrestler. But the problem with a study like this, I mean, this is very frightening, but when you think about this small group of 85 people in the huge population of the United States of America, or the world, it's a pretty small group. And so there's no denominator. And so this study, while it's concerning and it's frightening, suffers for something that we in research like to call ascertainment bias. And so we need to look at this more, definitely. But this doesn't mean that everybody that plays football or soccer or professional wrestling is going to have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And here's just an example of some of this Alzheimer's-like pathology that some of these people had. And so the question really becomes, should your kids or grandkids play sports? Should my kids play sports? Should we wrap them up in bubble wrap and send them outside, especially as we look at the rising obesity rate in America and all the problems that this can cause? And what I'd like to suggest to you is to remember that 70% of the concussions that occur outside of organized sports. And so, and again, if you think of the little kid on the skateboard going down the big hill, or I came home the other one day from work and my kid was about 3 stories up in a tree. You know, these are things that they do, and it's just part of life. And there's a lot of physical and psychological and emotional benefits to participation in sport. And so concussion isn't just a football problem. It happens, and it happens with life. And like anything that you do, you should try and mitigate the risk when you do it. So when you get in a car, you put a seatbelt on, or you should. If you bungee jump, you should check and make sure that the cord is connected to something. And so if you're going to play football, there are things that we can do to decrease the risk that you will get a concussion. We can limit the number of contact practices that you have, and they've done that in youth football. We can make sure that rules are enforced. In soccer, they're looking at changing the time when they introduce heading into different youth football practice leagues. In hockey, they're looking at changing the rules to increase the age at when they introduce checking, and or if they introduce checking at all. And enforcing the rules is quite important. You know, I was just in Canada when we went skiing, and I was watching some professional hockey because it's all that was on TV, and they were not enforcing the rules with fighting then. But there are things that you can do to decrease the rate of concussion besides just not play. And so the other things in terms of changing culture I think is really, really important. And somebody asked a question about there. The culture is changing. The culture is changing. It used to be that when somebody got a concussion, they would help their buddies hide the concussion so that they could get back out on the field. And now they turn their buddies in. People will come in and they'll say, you know what, you got to go take a look at Johnny because he is messed up. Or they will drag Johnny over and say, you know what, he doesn't know where he is. Doc, you need to help him out. Or I'll have somebody up and say, you know what, Doc, I have a headache. I think I have a concussion. I said, well, why do you think you have a concussion? Why did you get hit? No. Well, why don't you think it's just a headache? I don't know. You know, and so the culture is changing, and I think it's largely in part to the Zach Lystat law that Stan Herring and the group in Washington. This was the first law in the United States to be passed, and now 85% of the states in the United States have concussion laws on the books, and it is changing the culture, particularly at the youth leagues, and it's working its way up, and it will eventually. It's at the college level. We have people pulling themselves out and coming over and talking to me all the time that we did not have 2 years ago, and then sitting out with symptoms that they didn't used to do before. And I love the body language on that picture on the left there. And so this is a quiz before we go on to the next topic, sudden cardiac arrest. These are my 4 kids. 3 of my kids play football. The one on the left that's playing soccer also plays football. So which one has had the concussion? Only one of my kids has had a concussion out of my 4 kids. Any votes? So the soccer player, raise your hand. Okay, a couple. The basketball player? Or the football players? The basketball players had the concussion. The only one that doesn't play football has had the concussion. And he actually got it when he was at a birthday party ice skating. So again, none of them got it in organized sports. And we don't want to restrict our kids from going to birthday parties. They have to live lives. So we can talk. I do think football gets a little bit of a bad rap, and like in anything in life, we do have to do our best to do things smartly and mitigate risk, but we still have to live life. So next we're going to talk about sudden cardiac death. And I think it's particularly fitting that we talk about it today, March 5th. And you'll notice up here on the screen, it's Hank Gathers. And Hank Gathers was one of the greatest, I think, college basketball players of all time. And he died 23 years ago, almost to the day, of sudden cardiac arrest. And here it is 23 years later, almost a quarter of a century later. And I don't know that we're that much further along in terms of preventing our kids from dying of sudden cardiac arrest. And hopefully we can make some movement forward in that direction. And I think almost all of the pictures in here of kids are people who have died of sudden cardiac arrest. So sudden cardiac death is a leading cause of death in exercise in athletes. Exercise is a trigger for death in those who have underlying heart disease. And sudden cardiac death can be prevented by early detection of those who have heart problems and by rapid defibrillation in those who suffer sudden cardiac arrest. So I first became interested in this topic on New Year's Eve in 2002. And I was coming home from the Sun Bowl, and it was about midnight, and I got a call from the athletic director, and she said, you need to come to the emergency room. Kayla has had a heart attack, something's going on, and it's bad, and you need to get up here. And so one of my basketball players, one of my women basketball players. And so it was New Year's Eve. I thought that she'd gotten into something. And I'm like, Kayla, really? Because Kayla is a good kid. And that was almost 10 years ago, because I can remember I was pregnant with my youngest kid, who's 10. And Kayla's here tonight to talk to us a little bit about that. So I'd like to introduce Kayla Burt.
I have a loud voice, so hopefully you guys can hear me. Being New Year's Eve, I had 8 of my teammates over to my house. We were just going to have a really low-key night. Our coach was really mad at us because we had a really bad practice. She thought we were really unfocused on New Year's Eve. We were thinking about what we were doing later that night. And so she called for an 8 a.m. practice New Year's Day, which that's really early because she knows we have to stay up at least until midnight. So about 11:30, I went upstairs and started to kind of get ready for bed. And it had been an entirely normal day for me up until that point. I had a regular 3-hour practice. We lifted weights. I drove my car. I was being my normal goofy self. And 11:30, I just started to brush my teeth, and I was chatting with one of my teammates in my room, and I just kind of nonchalantly told her that I felt lightheaded. And so she didn't think twice about it, just because, like I said, I'd been acting so normal. Next thing she knows, I just literally slumped off my bed. And she thought I was joking or maybe having a seizure, and quickly realized that when I didn't move, she kind of looked over the edge of the bed and was like, haha, like, Kayla, get up, and that I didn't move. So the rest of the girls were downstairs. They all come running upstairs, and they flipped me over, and they basically said that I was lifeless. And my teammates, this part always gets me a little emotional, but they really acted like a team, and they didn't know exactly what they were doing or what they needed to do, but they did enough basically to sustain me until paramedics could get there. They started doing CPR. They made one minor mistake. They put me on the bed, which, as you guys know, to do CPR on someone, you probably don't want to put them on a bed because I'm just essentially bouncing. So they got me up on the bed, but paramedics, and you guys probably know, some of you know, that King County is probably the best place in the entire world to be for sudden cardiac arrest, just with our Medic One Foundation, our medics, and just the amount of training that they have. They were there very quickly. Shocked me one time, and I was brought down to UW, where I was in a 15-hour coma, and I just, the next day, I was trying to pull a tube out of my throat, and where am I? Why am I here? And I said, when's practice? And they were like, yeah, probably not. You've had a cardiac arrest, and you're very fortunate to be alive. And I didn't really understand what had happened to me so quickly, but basically in that moment, my entire life changed. I had to retire from basketball. I had an ICD implanted into my chest, which I still have to this day. Basically is there as a backup if this were ever to happen again. I sat out for a year and a half and just went through some further medical testing to kind of see what kind of life I could live with a diagnosis that I received. And I'm an active person. I wanted to be able to work out and maybe have kids someday. And they said, well, we think that you're maybe okay to play basketball. So Dr. Harmon and I, we had a couple of discussions. And I came back to play a year and a half. And my final season We were playing in a game against UCLA, and I had been in the game for about 4 minutes. We have our first media timeout, so I'm breathing hard, but I didn't really feel any different than I'd felt in any other game I'd played in with my device. And I'm sitting there listening to my coach, and I get a big jolt, and I think that maybe some crazy fan came out of the stands and just punched me in the chest as hard as they could. I had no idea what happened because I was completely conscious. Process of elimination, realized that I had been shocked by my internal device, and Dr. Harmon and our team trainer were there right away. They knew something was probably wrong. They kind of walked me back into the tunnel, and 1 minute and 10 seconds later, it shocked me again. It also shocked Dr. Harmon. So she can thank me for that. So we've both been shocked.
This is making me nervous standing
I know, she's like, she knows what this is like. But in that moment, I realized, okay, I'm done. Life's more important than basketball. I'd already accomplished more than I ever thought that I would, and got my degree in 2006. And to this day, I live a normal, healthy life, and I owe a lot to Dr. Harmon and just the research and work that she's done, and Nick of Time Foundation, just a lot of people. We've all worked really hard to help prevent these things from happening to other families and to other people. So thank you guys so much.
So I'd like to thank Kayla, because a lot of the research that you're going to see tonight is directly related to the interest that she spurred. So at that time, estimates were that sudden cardiac death occurred about 1 in 200,000 to 1 in 300,000, which isn't very often. The estimates were that they said, ECG can identify some of this, but that really there's so many people that come back with false positive, it's not worth doing this in people ahead of time. And the low incidence and the absence of a low screening tool really make this impractical and not cost effective. But there was a study out in Italy, and in Italy they'd had a really high incidence of sudden cardiac arrest, and they implemented adding to their screening, their history and physical, they added doing a screening ECG in their athletic population, and over the course of 20 years, what happened is their rate of sudden cardiac death in athletes went down over 89%. And you can see this trend right here. And you thought, wow, if they did this in Italy, why couldn't we do that here? And the reason they said that we didn't do this here in the United States is because they said, well, in the United States, our rate of sudden cardiac death is really already low. Sudden cardiac death in the United States doesn't happen very often here, so we don't need to worry about it. And the reason they said that is because we had pretty bad research here. Because to get an incidence rate, you need two things. You need a numerator and you need a denominator. And the studies that have been done in the United States up to that point really were these numerators had been collected by media reports, so people just looked at newspapers and said, well, look, a kid died here and a kid died here. And the denominators, they're like, well, there's about 1 million kids that play football, and there's about 1 million kids that play soccer, and so they sort of guessed at the denominator, and they had the media reports for the numerator, and they're like, we think this is our incidence. And that's not great research. And so, and that's how they got that number. And so what had occurred to our group here at the University of Washington was that, we've got this great pool of athletes where we know exactly how many of them are. It's called the NCAA. There's 400,000 student athletes. We know what sport they play. We know what sex they are. We know their ethnicity. And they're pretty high profile, too. And so we know when most of them pass away. And we actually thought at the time when we thought about this, we thought that they probably had to tell the NCAA, that the NCAA probably kept track of them when they died. And so we thought we need to study this in the NCAA. And so that's what we did. And 2 years ago, this study came out in circulation. And it was an unfortunate thing that we later learned is that the NCAA actually has no requirement for reporting death in their athletes. They just voted on emergency legislation last month. It didn't pass by one vote. It's now going through their regular legislative cycle, and we're hopeful that it'll pass that way. But we could still identify some cases, and we tried to identify them by 3 different ways. They have something called the resolutions list, which basically, if you have an athlete who dies in the NCAA, you can send their name in, and at the annual convention, there's a moment of silence that they've had their athletes who pass away. So it's not required, but most schools will send their names in. We had a database that a parent group, which is an advocate. They're mostly made up of people who have lost kids to sudden cardiac arrest. They do media searches every week, and they're pretty intensive media searches. And so we had a media database done by some pretty dedicated people of kids who had died of. So we had that media database, and then we had the NCAA. They gave us their insurance claim data because one of the people that we were working with was an NCAA person. And so we had those databases, and then we did something called a capture-recapture analysis, which is a statistical technique where if you have more than one database, you can do this statistics and you can find out how many you think you have. And when we did this when my statistician did this statistical analysis, it appeared that we captured between 90 and 100% of the deaths. So when we used all these databases and combined them together, it looked like we had a pretty good list of names here. And between the years of 2004 and 2008, so this 5 years of death, we looked at almost 2 million athletes. There were 273 deaths, and of them, about 45 were suspected cardiac deaths. The resolutions list picked up 87% of those deaths. The media database, only 56% of deaths. So these are our highest profile athletes. And the media Division I athletes. And if you're looking in the paper, you're only going to find just a little over half of those deaths. And the insurance claims data, which is where some of those numbers, the 1 in 200,000 numbers came from, insurance claims only got 20% of those deaths. And the incidence, which before had been stated as 1 in 200,000 or 1 in 300,000, was 1 in 43,000 in our study. So much, much, much higher than had been previously suspected. And here's our little pie chart here, and you can see that the vast majority of deaths in the NCAA were caused by accidents, but the next biggest cause is cardiac deaths right here, and more than homicide and suicide combined. And we've done a lot of talk about concussion tonight, or head injury. It doesn't even make the pie chart. And if we look at this even more, drill down this even further, you can see that the death rate is more in males, 1 in 33,000, than females, 1 in 76,000. More in African Americans, 1 in 17,000, than in Caucasians, which is 1 in 58,000. And these kids down here, they're not just kids' pictures that I put up there that were being sporty. These are kids who died in the study. And then one of the interesting things that we did is we could look at this data by sport. And one of the really interesting things that came out is the death rate in basketball was 1 in 11,000. The other sports, there are some other sports, but basketball really stood out. Why is basketball such a dangerous sport to play? And so let's look at basketball a little bit closer. Basketball in Division I, if you're a Division I male basketball player, your risk of sudden cardiac death is 1 in 3,000, whether you're black or white. That's really high. And having 4 basketball players, that makes me nervous. And again, we can't figure out why this is the case, but it's really frightening. The risk in females compared to their baseline level risk is about double, but it's really high in Division I male basketball players. And so when you're looking at a risk versus a baseline risk of maybe 1 in 43,000, you can't make an argument not to screen a male basketball player at the NCAA level. So you could say maybe you shouldn't screen a golfer, but you can't make an argument not to screen a male basketball player. And so what about high school incident? This is a little bit harder to find. And part of that's just because media reports are less likely to report deaths in high school athletes. We found in Division II and Division III they were less likely to get reported, and in women the deaths were less likely to get reported just because they were less high profile. And also in high school you get multi-sport athletes and you have club sport athletes, and so it's just harder to find these numbers in high school. But we did a survey. Our group did a survey. It was a cross-sectional survey. We surveyed 1,700 high schools who had on-site AED programs. And in those programs, there were 14 sudden cardiac arrests in student athletes. 9 of those student athletes survived, 5 died. And so that makes a rate of sudden cardiac arrest of 1 in 23,000. So pretty high rate of sudden cardiac arrest. This rate of sudden cardiac death was 1 in 63,000. So the rate of death was pretty low, but that's because so many people were saved with the AEDs. So if you happen to have a sudden cardiac arrest at a school with an AED program, that's a good deal. The sudden cardiac arrest rate was 2.7 times the rate of sudden cardiac death. And then we did, this is actually a preview study. One of my fellows is going to present this next month at a national meeting. We did a 2-year prospective observational study of 2,000 high schools where we called them up every quarter and said, hey, have you had a sudden cardiac arrest at your school? And so can you imagine calling 2,000 high schools every 3 months? I didn't do that. That's why you have residents and fellows and things like that. And in that group, there were 18 athletes who had sudden cardiac arrest. And really interesting is that they had 16 males and only 2 females. So this really seems that males have a lot more sudden cardiac arrest than females. There were 8 students that were non-athletes that had sudden cardiac arrest. And we didn't have any information on ethnicity or race or on that. Males had the significantly higher incidence, and we didn't see that higher preponderance in basketball athletes in this group. And so this is something we still need to do research on. Our 10-year data on our NCAA study is going to be out in about a year and a half, and so we're excited to look at that. So the exciting thing in that prospective study that we did is that 16 of 18 of those kids survived. And so we're seeing that schools with AED programs are saving kids. And so that's I think, just a wonderful thing. So the rate of sudden cardiac death in this latest study was 1 in 800,000 almost. And again, not because kids aren't having sudden cardiac arrest, because we're saving them when they do. The rate of sudden cardiac arrest was about 1 in 87,000. And so when there's 2 ways to prevent sudden cardiac death. And secondary prevention is that once people have a sudden cardiac arrest, we save them with an AED or defibrillation, and that is this chain of survival: early recognition, early CPR, and early AED. And you know, the single greatest factor affecting survival rate after sudden cardiac arrest is the time that you can get to defibrillation. Historic survival rates from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in most U.S. cities is less than 8%, so Kayla is very lucky to be here. In King County or Seattle, it's about 58%. So we are all very lucky to live here in Seattle, and it's something to think about the next time a levy or vote comes up for our Medic One program. And this is just a nice graph that people show a lot. And you can see that for every minute that you go not being defibrillated after you've had a sudden cardiac arrest, your chances of survival decrease by 7 to 10%. So you want to get defibrillated quick if you have a sudden cardiac arrest. And this just shows their increasing survival rate from AED program in student athletes as we sort of get better at implementing emergency action plans in schools. So primary prevention is the other thing that I want to talk about, and that basically means screening. There's 8 million high school physicals that we perform every year at a cost of $250 million. It's required in every state and in the NCAA. We have forms that we recommend. The first edition was put out in 1992. The last edition in 2010. The book is 182 pages long. I was on the writing group that helped put it together, and it's very detailed. And the AHA has a cardiac form that they recommend, and they've recommended a couple times and haven't changed it much. We know that the primary reason that we do sports physicals is that we are looking for things that can kill kids. That's why the AHA, that's why the American Academy of Family Practice, the American Academy of Pediatrics says that we do sports physicals. We want to find things that can cause sudden cardiac death. And we know, and this slide shows that study after study after study shows that about 1 in 300 kids will have something that can predispose them to sudden cardiac death. Now, obviously, not everybody dies of sudden cardiac death that has something like this, but they have something that could predispose them to sudden cardiac death. And if we can find it, sometimes we can fix it, sometimes we can do something, change their activity, but we can prevent some of these kids from dying, hopefully all of them. And so that's the aim of primary prevention. But the unfortunate thing is, after 20 or 30 years of having this PPE monograph and these recommendations from the American Heart Association out there, 37% of Washington State primary care physicians and less than half of them even know about these recommendations. And so we're not doing a very good job as medical professionals about getting the word out. It's been 20, 30 years. And so the question right now that I have for us is really, can we do better? Can we do better? It's been 23 years since Hank Gathers died. The Italians can do better. I think we can do better. So the stated barriers to doing ECG screening in the United States is that there's low incidence, and I've tried to convince you in the last couple minutes that we don't have a low incidence. So the other barriers are that there's a high false positive rate to reading ECGs in athletes. And what that basically means is when you get an ECG, there's all these squiggles on it that represent the structural and electrical function of an athlete's heart. And in an athlete, they have a lot of changes that in somebody like me might represent pathology. But in an athlete, they're just the regular changes that are related to them training, to strenuous training. And in fact, 60% of athletes will have something that in somebody who doesn't exercise strenuously might be concerning. And so I would propose to you that physicians can learn to differentiate these normal training-related changes from pathologic or concerning changes. And so to test this hypothesis, we took 40 ECGs, 12 of them were abnormal, and 28 of them were just training-related changes in athletes. And we gave them to 60 different physicians. 22 of them were primary care residents, 16 of them were attendings, 12 of them were sports medicine physicians, and 10 were cardiologists. And what we did is we had them read the ECGs once, and then we gave them this little cheat sheet that basically said, here's how you read an ECG in an athlete, that had some examples on it, and then we had them read them again. And the first time they read them, you can see that the cardiologists were much better, and then the second time that they read them, everybody got much better. And statistically, the cardiologists were no different from the other physicians. They're still a little bit better, but statistically they were about the same. So if we could actually teach people how to read ECGs really pretty easily by just giving them a sheet, and if we actually make some effort about teaching them, we can do a pretty good job. At least that's the theory. So what we did last year is we brought the world's experts to Seattle. The American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, which is this society that we've been talking about. FIFA sponsored it. FMARC is their medical arm. The British Journal of Sports Medicine. And we all came down here, and this is Domenico Corrado, who's the lead author of that Italian study. This is Sanjay Sharma, who's from England, and Mats Borgesen, who's from Sweden. This is John Dresner, who is the chair of the committee and is one of our partners here at the University of Washington. And we came down and we had this big conference and said, let's figure out what changes on an ECG are normal in an athlete and what are abnormal in an athlete. And let's all get together and have a consensus. And we did that, and we called them the Seattle criteria. Then what that resulted in was this nice journal article, a collection of articles that teaches people how to read ECGs in athletes. And that is going to be translated into an e-learning module that will be freely available to any physician. So if you are a sports physician in Africa and you're taking care of a soccer team there, you can go to this e-learning module and learn how to read ECGs, because an ECG is actually a really relatively cheap thing to do. Or if you're a pediatrician in Ohio, wherever you want to do it, it's free. And so hopefully we are getting rid of that fourth barrier right there. And here in Seattle, we have been working on screening now for the past couple years, and it's largely due to the hard work and dedication of some really, really amazing people. And right now, I'd like to introduce you to one of them.
As Dr. Harmon said, I'm Darla Varenti. I'm the Executive Director for the Nick of Time Foundation. And the picture you see behind me is my 16-year-old son, Nicholas. He was a multi-sport athlete, played football, and died at the age of 16 from a sudden cardiac arrest. That picture was taken 8 days before he died. You'd never know by looking at him that he had a heart condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's the leading cause of death in exercising young athletes. And it's something a lot of times the media reports that you hear about called enlarged heart, but it's also known as HCM. So our family decided that we wanted to do something about this once we realized that this was something that was happening every other day to a young athlete, and that it wasn't rare. Just ask any of the families who it's happened to, and that we wanted to make a difference and do something about it. So with the help of some amazing doctors, Dr. Harmon and Dr. Rao included, from the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Hospital, we put together a screening program. And we offer screenings 8 to 10 times a year in the Puget Sound area for kids at high schools for free. So there's no cost associated with it to the parents. And it's something that we feel strongly is needed, because the only way you can identify these heart conditions that kill children is through an ECG reading, and then if needed, we also have the capability to do a brief echo. So we have been doing this now for a couple years. Kim's going to give you the statistics on what we found, but it's a very effective program that breaks down a lot of the barriers that people talk about. So at the very least, if you have a child who's an athlete, you need to press when you take them for a well child check or a sports physical to see if an EKG is available. Because as you know, when you take your children now for a physical, all they do is listen to their heart. And these conditions that kill the kids are not something you can see or just hear. You have to be able to take a picture of the heart and be able to do it. So it's something that we do community-based. We have over 100 volunteers who come and work with us for the day, and we screen close to 500 kids every time we do a screening. So it's something that we feel very strongly about as a family. We also are big proponents of emergency preparedness plans, of having AEDs in our schools, and learning CPR and how to use an AED. So those three programs kind of work together to make sure that our kids are safe.
Darla and Sue, our amazing Nick Time Foundation, have really done so much for our community, our kids in this community. I can't say enough about them. Our community heart screens, here's some pictures of them, and a lot of volunteers. First screen was in January 2008. We screened 21 schools. And in 2010, we screened 2,100 people, 3,000 people last year. And so far this year, we screened 1,888 people. 7,000 kids in all we've screened. And this year so far, we've found 9 serious heart problems. And these are things that kids may have died from. And the rate this year so far, and this has been actually a bad year in terms of finding things, is about 1 in 200, so higher than average. And this is one of them. And this is Will, and he and his parents have given us his permission to use his picture in his story. He's a 15-year-old cross-country athlete who had no symptoms. He was found to have a critically dilated aorta at a screen. This past December, he had surgery to replace his aortic valve and repair his aorta, and he's registered to run the St. Patty's Day Dash in 2 weeks. And so he's doing really well, and this is a life saved, and this is why we do this. So as far as sudden cardiac death goes, this can be prevented using a multifaceted approach. Through primary prevention, screening ECGs, my kids have all been screened, building infrastructure. We need to continue to do research so we know what works, what doesn't work. We need to figure out how to do this better, how to do it right. And so all the NICA time screening data, we keep track of it, and we research it so that we can continue to do this better. AEDs should be everywhere. Everybody should know CPR, and everyone should have a Medic One program as good as the ones we have in Seattle and King County. I want to give a shout out to the University of Washington Sports Cardiology group here. I feel fortunate to be part of this and to be able to work with the sports medicine people and the cardiologists that we work with here. This is a great group, and it's really fun. And then I hope that you all will visit us at the University of Washington Sports Medicine Clinic at the Husky Stadium. That's going to be opening in September 2013.
Oh my God.